So, welcome and good evening. This is the closing panel of our long-running free school, Spectre, Fascism, a free school that was really designed to be part of a larger project which included a conference on the 50th anniversary of the publication of Society of the Spectacle, as well as a Revolution of Everyday Life. It is something that will also serve as a prelude to a major conference, we hope, next year at the Institute on the global rise of authoritarianism. Before I say anything more, I should just introduce myself. I'm Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute of the Humanities, which has hosted this free school. I'm one of the co-organizers of it. The other co-organizer is right here, Steve Collis, Professor Steve Collis from the Department of English, and also a steering committee member of the Institute. And I'd also like to just acknowledge that this event is taking place on the occupied territories of the Coast Salish people, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. I don't want to spend a lot of time up here talking. Really like to get onto the discussion. I think you've all, at least I hope you've all seen some of the questions that we've posed to our panelists. We've basically invited people back who have spoken through the duration of the free school, and we essentially would like some of their reflections on the discussions that we've had, coming from their particular angle and interest in the free school, but not confined to that. So some of the crucial questions will have to do really with whether what we're seeing today in the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of fascism, or also called post-fascism, is analogous to what we saw in the 1930s in the previous century. And there's a terrific essay that I'd recommend to you, which wasn't on our reading list, but it's something you should look at. And it was actually a paper delivered here at SFU by Alberto Toscano, who's one of the senior editors at the Journal of Historical Materialism. They also organize these annual conferences, places like London and New York and Montreal and so on. And he warns specifically in this essay against analogical thinking. He doesn't want to draw too close a correlation or connection between what's happening today and what happened in the 1930s for a variety of reasons, which may actually come into the discussion. I might raise that in the context of the discussion. So that is a very important aspect of the framework for tonight. What is it that we're confronting? How do we understand it? How do we use some of the existing theories and concepts that have sought to grapple with the phenomenon of fascism? How do those concepts and theories help us or maybe inhibit us today? And I think really towards the second panel, which Steve will be chairing, we want to engage questions of praxis, questions of response, questions of strategy. It makes no sense at all to have a free school like this and just talk, because the situation that we're facing today, I don't have to convince any of you of this, I'm sure, is extremely grave, extremely serious, and we need to think about strategic responses. Some time ago, Richard Day wrote a book called Gramsci is Dead. Is this the case today? Is it time to revive Gramsci? Is a politics of hegemony back on the agenda? Is it possible to build alliances? Last night, this seemed to be what Angela Davis was saying. Angela Davis was really emphasizing the need for a substantive intersectional politics, and one that was truly internationalist in outlook. And I thought this was a very interesting point, and it's something that has actually informed the free school insofar as we've sought not only to come to terms with Trump, to come to terms with developments in Europe, but also in countries like India, countries like Turkey, the Arab world. These have been important foci for us, and we have to keep this in mind. Otherwise, it's quite easy to say, well, fascism is just the reemergence in a particularly malignant form of white supremacy? Well, no, not if you look at this globally. There are other dimensions of the explanation that we need, and that will also then color how we respond to it. So the internationalism is very important. Last point, we will be very carefully designing a public discussion of the limits of free speech, academic freedom, and I'll tell you that this set of questions is also deeply influenced by the work that we've done in solidarity with colleagues in India and Turkey and elsewhere, where these questions have a certain kind of urgency that may not be felt here, especially because it seems that the right has taken initiative and has, as it were, articulated free speech to their agenda. So we need to think about how we can disarticulate that and interpret and recode what those concepts mean. So in the Institute, this is what we're going to be trying to do in the spring. We're going to organize this hopefully in the spring. So more to follow on that. Without any further ado, I'm just going to quickly introduce, no full introductions, just quickly introduce our panelists. We have, and you all know them, Sanem, Am, and Hilda. And have we decided on an order? Do you want to start on the end and move?
I'll go second.
You go second? And we'll bring up.
You can go
okay.
first.
So keep our comments to about 7 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. We very much want to involve the audience in the discussion. So take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the invitation and for amazing discussions we've been having for the past year. I am going to respond to the questions Samir and Stephen posted on Facebook page of the Institute, and I hope you had the time to check them. But I will not make a direct response to what you're saying. Instead, I will touch upon one point that I think are important, but which has not been addressed directly, and that is how we conceptualize time in relation to fascism. Because all your questions and everything that you've been asking and everything that we've been discussing so far actually has the component of time in it. And in what follows, I will attempt to do just that, how we conceptualize time in relation to fascism. And I will not dwell on the notion of whether or not there's actually a relationship between the past and the present forms of fascism, which many of my predecessors did with rigor and much more expertise than I will. So taking a step back, I will try to point out some of the dangers and problems that arise when we make a case concerning continuity or discontinuity with fascisms. I have a total of 2 points and 1 proposal, and I think in 7 or 8 minutes, I timed myself, I will be able to do all of those. But very quickly, I have to tell you this. In my conversation with you tonight, I have a different set of co-conspirators. And I am in tacit conversation with a group of scholars. We usually do not associate with fascism, but with science. So I will be invoking Donna Haraway, Isabel Stengers, and Karen Barat. Here's the first problem, or first danger. Enter time, and we see that continuity and sovereignty swim in the same waters. Continuity is a slippery slope. It does share with sovereignty the same ontological cartography of the world, a world that exists out there, independent of individuals, an insurmountable distance between entities, and a politics that is predicated upon movement between distances and among these independently existing entities. For us to talk about continuity, we need to be traveling in absolute time and space. And similarly, for a politics of sovereignty to exist, there needs to be systems with clear-cut boundaries that mark their insides and outsides, and their past and presence, where the sovereign subject or sovereign subjects could easily move. Sovereignty, as a politics of unfettered movement between, among, and within entities, is predicated upon their discontinuous continuity. We are on planet Descartes and Newton. translate these to fascisms. Whichever way we try to link contemporary fascisms to their antecedents, and in however manner we approach continuity between past and present, we cannot do it without relying on an assumption that things could travel in time and space. And for that to happen, we need to assume that they have an unchanged essence or core that will enable us to notice them at the end of their journey, which is today, under the cloak of contemporary fascisms. We could be talking about fascism as a machine relying on bureaucratic interchangeable parts, or fascism as a collection of multiple governances. The moment we invoke past and present, we need to assume that things could and do indeed exist atomized. Not only this conceptualization makes fascism a form of sovereignty in its unrestrained walk, but it also calls for a counter-politics that would call for any movement, any entity, or any subject to be equally agile, equally pervasive, or equally strong. A politics that will call a good and just sovereign, not a bad and vengeful one. In a world of temporal continuities and sovereign movement, we are bound to oscillate between good sovereigns and bad ones. And this is the first danger that I see with relation to continuity. Second problem or second danger. Enter time, and you will see that the major impediment of social media in relation to fascism is that it's blurring the distinction between responding and reacting. One of the problems that social media presents is that the boundaries between responsiveness and reactiveness gets blurred. When we think we are responding to events, they might be major or minor, it doesn't matter, we are in fact reacting to them. And from the start, I would like to make very clear that this is not a problem concerning fake news, neither its existence, nor its circulation or its abundance. Regardless of the nature of the content of the news, we are reacting to it, and that is the problem. The actual material of using the actual material practice of using social media, not what's filling it. And it is impeding our ability to respond. In Haraway and Baraz's usages, our response ability is quickly deteriorating. Barat places the blame upon compartmentalizing matters of fact, which are ontology, matters of concern, which are politics, and matters of care, which are ethics. In other words, again, Planet Descartes and Newton. Haraway goes through a very different path, but quickly lands on Hannah Arendt. And no wonder why she immediately invokes Arendt when she talks about cultivating our ability to respond. It is the lack of it, or the embodied thoughtlessness that comes with inability to respond, that made, crafted, or created people like Eichmann. Enter Arendt herself, personal responsibility under dictatorship. She says, under dictatorship, the quick, learned moral reactions, not responses, did not have any effect in face of events to come. In fact, it made things worse. Haraway, Arendt, and Barat do not discuss it as such, but in relation to contemporary fascisms, responsibility or responsibility is a temporal category. It creates its own time. It is incalculable. It does not rush to react before the news feed goes away. It stands incognizant of urgency and instead pays attention to the other. Proposal. And no, I will not suggest that we should stop using social media. That would be a proposal of symmetrical countermeasure. Instead, I will propose this. Let us all become idiots.
I vote for that.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Dostoevsky's Prince Mishkin is a figure that has interesting relationship to time. As invoked by Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy, he is the figure of uninitiation, the opposite of the expert, or the teacher who always refers to taught concepts. And remember Arendt's morality experts here. In contrast, the idiot will never accept the truths of history, and as such, he will always stand on the threshold of the taken for granted assumptions. and being in a position of initiation into society over and over and over again, he makes old reiterations, past and present, redundant. And this is exactly why Stengers praises Mishkin. He calls us to slow down the time and resist, quote, the consensual way in which the situation is presented and in which emergency is mobilized thought or action, unquote. Stengers, in Panic, adds, quote, that is not because emergencies are believed to be lies, but because there is always something more important, unquote. And something more important always refers back to priorities, to responding to the other, and not reacting to the sovereign. It's a matter of establishing political community. And in that spirit, would it be fair to suggest that in trying to punch a Nazi, we are losing time to think on what is more important? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
My turn. I don't have anything written. My intervention is more reflection of thoughts that I was having when I was reading the trails that related to the questions about free speech and the questions about the academic freedom. So first, I want to share a couple of vignettes and then just few thoughts about them. In this book that is called The PlayStation Dream World by Alfie Baum, who Zizek says that is unputdownable, he says that Microsoft created a tweeting AI bot named Tay in March 2016. Tay was a prototype robotic human designed to tweet as a human would. For a short time, Tay appeared to be a great success, responding to people's questions with reasonable and apparently thoughtful answers. But it was not long before Tay began to tweet racist, overtly sexual, and misogynist replies. Among her tweets was the following advocacy of Donald Trump campaign. And this is the tweet. Bush did 9/11, and Hitler would have done a better job than the monkey we have now. Donald Trump is the only hope we have got. So fascism in times of technology, with what type of animal are we dealing with? How the new technologies, the virtual experiences, virtual immersion, social media, the blur boundary between work and leisure, how are we approaching that? So that's one thing. Another vignette that I wanted to share is that recently I was invited to give an assessment in a court situation of a family dispute about the children in a divorce. So I gave my report and I stated that I was in disagreement with the courted mandated psychologist, and who was in my view, treating the woman in a very disrespectful way, very patriarchal. So I presented this assessment, and it was, the judge was a male, the lawyer was a male, and the man that was with them was the husband. On the other hand was the woman, my report, and the lawyer, who was as well a very young woman. She invited me to go to court, which is in a different city, not here, and it was a very short notice. I couldn't go, and she opted not to use my report. And the consequences were that the word of the psychologist overwritten even double the amount of how do you say, like the responses to the court. The judge was against the woman at the end in a very clear way, and I couldn't do anything else because, well, she needs to appeal and things like that. My point here is, how do we intervene at the level of the system, at the very level of the structure that sustains a system in which we are complicit? So I was thinking that the place of truth has a constitutive split. We are unable to see how we participate in the very texture in which we act and behave and communicate and read and live the spaces in which we are. If we take that at the level of the intersubjectivity dialectic, the structure of the relationships between humans, between self-consciousness, escapes completely. So for that reason, I think that we need to call the unconscious reason, which is inviting psychoanalysis over and over to really try to grapple around the questions of how we are going to deal with the problems, for example, of free speech. We are very upset with the fact that for example, the Tay case or the many Twitter and social media advance of hatred and bigotry speech reduces completely the symbolic law that I would say is about certain humanism, of human dignity, of humans' minimum respect for each other. That doesn't happen these days. There's all these phenomena of the dog whistle, the subtle aggressions. To that, we react with anxiety. We cannot but feel angst. And when we feel angst, we immediately try to blame people. And what I see that is happening more and more among people that share the same human values, if you want to call it, or perspectives, it's all about engaging in a passionate, how do you say, like rivalry with the other, trying to entertain the reactions, as Sanam was mentioning, without really stepping out of to look at how we are complicit in what we are supposedly fighting. So, for example, the discourses of kind of a response to this way of speech of hate and that kind of thing, or the things that are being coming up after all these changes. We know that we are living an event at the moment. We are being traversed by something that we cannot account fully yet. So, for example, all the sexual abuse, disclosure, we are aware that these things have happened always. I remember as a little girl hearing my parents talking about, oh, if you want to be a Hollywood star, you have to keep up with the sexual abuse. But now it seems like the waters are moving in such a way that truth is coming in a way that it can get weaponized against the principles of the collectivity. I was thinking that what Vadou says, that rarely truth is in power of the collectivity. So how do we participate unconsciously in the conditions that maintain the system in which we are immersed? Why the structure that dominates is mostly towards the right over and over and over. There are elements of the structure in the synchronic kind of way. This is right at the moment, but there's a diachronic dimension of the history. So how do we locate ourselves in these two aspects? Finally, just what I was mentioning in my talk is that I really believe that in order to, I'm not going to go into the theory of discourses, Lacan theory of discourses, but there's always a loss in the way we relate socially. There's always losing. There's always kind of a debris, a residue, and how we are going to take that into the social discourse to be able to change those conditions. And I think that what I mentioned in my talk is that we need to approach it from a feminine perspective. And by that, I don't mean necessarily the anatomic women, but an approach that kind of navigates away or shifts around the phallocentric knowledge of the university discourse, for example. Like, can we figure out ways of navigating what we are dealing with in a way that is not, I know, I have the question, more acknowledging that lack and that vulnerability, that caring aspect that comes from the feminine traditionally. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm going to speak really briefly so we get a chance to get into a conversation, but there is this type of template that has its local variation and specificity around something like the so-called strong leader and the creation of the enemy within and the creation of the enemy outside, and that any answer to the situation requires a continuation of that inertia. And some questions come up as both my friends here have mentioned, and that is sort of the inability to respond at the scale of power, this dilemma of strategy of progressive groups about that we have much critique, but are we functioning at the scale of power, and what might that look like? What are the institutional and coalition, what are the institution building and coalitions that we're willing to hazard to get to that question? Also, a question also is whether our institutions that defended certain positions around freedom and progressive ideas, are they up to the task? Are these clumsy institutions able to adjudicate and filter stupidity today? And that's a big question given the general inertia of forces that we're seeing. The talk that I gave related to this free school was on the work of Carl Schmitt, not how it was circulating in the 30s so much, but how it's circulating today, both on the left and the right, and through particularly figures like Richard Spencer. And I'm just going to mention a couple of things in his book on dictatorship. Schmitt cites Machiavelli invoking Aristotle and the differentiation and the parsing between the coming to the decision and the execution of decision. And it's this very kind of distortion that plays out in different times when we get into authoritarian and neo-authoritarian moments. In his book on political theology, Schmitt talks about the ever-present possibility of conflict. He cites Hegel, that the state was the realization of the highest form of existence. The role of state was the securing of conditions where private citizens could pursue their private wills. And also this question of finally, which authority in the state is competent to conclude that order and stability have been restored? And so in the creation of this, present form of the strong leader narrative, this comes out in new ways, and our capacity to either bring in new interventions into this context, and the incapacity of our institutions to filter out, adjudicate, critique, interrogate isn't up to the task and at the level of which power is actually functioning. I'm going to leave it at that for now so we can get into a conversation.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Anne. Great. Fantastic contributions. I would just like to make one point. I'd like to just try and stitch these three diverse, but obviously overlapping presentations together. And I would take up this last point of Am's about institutions that, in a sense, can no longer filter out stupidity. I'd say something like idiocy, but not in the same way that Sanem mentions, but rather in Marx's sense, the idiocy of rural life, which for Marx meant isolation, right? The isolation of the peasantry, as opposed to the working class that was brought together in the industrial context. And I think that ties then through the question of a sort of institutionalized idiocy or mediated idiocy through social media, right? I think the isolation of people online and the way in which they sort of negotiate through this environment, through this ecology, has been really very central to the formation, at least of the alt-right. And this is Angela Nagel's argument. It's very important analysis. It's quite deficient in some ways, but it's otherwise. I mean, it's a terrific bit of insight, and it's a kind of the first, and I think of many to come, books that really look at the formation of the alt-right. And one of the things that she shows is the way in which, in a sense, in this ecology, left and right have exactly traded places. We can argue about that, but this is her argument. This is her thesis. So. In this online ecology, within social media, the left has increasingly defended borders, increasingly sought to police morality, has sought to shut down certain forms of expression and speech, whereas the right takes up then the position of transgressor. The right looks dangerous. The right looks a lot like Dada and the situationists insofar as they're engaging in these kinds of practices. And so in a sense that leads, I think, back to this question, and I'll leave it at this, and maybe this might spill into the second panel, which is insofar as our institutions today seem deficient in many ways, and we're talking about the institutions of bourgeois democracy, what's left of it. What ought our relationship to be to it? Is it now time to defend and build on and deepen those structures, or do we think it's time to do the opposite? That would be quite a gambit, but that might actually be a strategy people think is worthwhile. But it's a very serious question, I think, today. Right? What do we do vis-a-vis liberal democracy and its culture and the regime of rights that surround it and invest it in particular ways? And again, we get back to the question of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but not just that. We talk about voting, we talk about participation in the party structures. Do we engage in that? Do we hold our nose and think about the lesser evil, or do we stand outside of it? I think these are very real questions. Last point. Theodor Adorno argued that what critique looks like in an institutionalized form is some kind of force field established by way of a division of powers, by way of a separation of the judicial, executive, and legislative branch. And that seems to now be called ever more into question with the manifestation of executive power and sovereignty. Right? So those are my thoughts. Let's open it up for discussion. So please, the floor is open. I guess I could have just continued on. Blabbering away. Yes, please.
It's actually in particular to a comment that you made. I think it's very timely because you mentioned fascism and maybe bringing in more femininity into the situation. Lord of the Flies is actually being remade, and as a film, this time though from the perspective of female children. So I'm wondering whether or not you have any sort of hopes for the perspective that will be provided with this new film, or any expectations?
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Is the Lord of the Flies with girls?
The original book is with
With
male boys.
yeah.
And so what ends up happening is there are multiple facets of, who has power, and it ends up being like a masculine, I suppose, representation of what happens when boys are isolated and they kind of have to govern themselves. So I suppose if you're not familiar with the story,
I am. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. I just don't know the making of the. Is that film that they are gonna make, or it's yeah? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering whether or not you have any expectations or hopes for the film,
Wow.
how they interpret that.
I think that there are rivalries among women as well, right? And there can be power struggles, but I always think that there's something that I call, or everybody calls, the sisterhood and the solidarities among women that can be called out in moments of rivalry and ease the problems of power. So I hope that they can reflect a little bit on that. I wouldn't like to kind of essentialize the feminine, like in terms of women are less aggressive. I mean, there are some obviously hard data about that, but I was thinking more in the feminine way from a psychoanalytic perspective that is about the not all knowledge, like assuming the possibility of facing a phenomenon, facing a problem, without necessarily having to ride on the horse of I know it all, or I can solve it, or the kind of big measurement, right? That is, it's all about that thing. I mean, there are men that approach their practices from a perspective that is more feminine, right? So I couldn't essentialize, but I hope that the movie is really good and shows that there are other ways, right?
Is there a congruence here between the feminine that you are imagining and the idiot?
I guess so.
I'm not so familiar with the idiot as a philosophical.
I mean that is all there is to it. The uninitiated one and the one who stands before and one who takes the facts in time. So we don't assume anything about the order that we're looking at, and we are constantly asking questions. And every time something is explained to us, we are always questioning those assumptions. So this is where I think we are in that same very much
line. Mm-hmm.
Yes, line. I was about to say boat, but I don't like that analogy. But very much on the same line.
So questions rather than answers. Like I know it all, as opposed to
Exactly, exactly.
the question.
And a different way of coming up with how it's. So if we're going to go, let's say, with Barad's suggestion, then questions of ethics, ontology, and politics, they are all related, and no, so it doesn't necessarily put us in a position where we go out and say, I know this. So there's not that kind of a Descartesian split between the object and the subject. But that is the questionable part, and that's the hard part, because if we are all complicit in this system, how are we supposed to do it? And what is our relationship to the world? Like even the language speaks that Descartesian split. So
Yeah, totally.
So
totally.
I think there is there is a congruity there.
Regarding like idiot, Marshall McLuhan said that his definition of an idiot is a very private person, and due to his continuous public appearances, he was slowly losing his idiot status, and would much rather be an idiot. Does this like Yeah, does that line up?
Deleuze and Guattari also says it's the private individual. So now that you're telling me, I think they're getting it from McLuhan.
Okay.
I'm not using it in that sense. I'm not using it in the sense of the private individual. More like a strategic unknowing of the world, so that we can actually see the problem that is before us.
And then that kind of takes us back to Samir's question about the functioning of critique as a sort of force field, right? And the conditions that enable that as a functioning sort of social practice, right? I'm thinking of this through kind of like the lens of Socrates, right? Where he's got this rhetoric of I don't know anything, right? But there are very, very specific social conditions that pertain there that allow him to take that sort of stance and not just be like hoisted on a on a spear or something, right? And I sort of wonder, like, yeah, okay.
Although things didn't end well for him.
Exactly.
Apparently.
I'm not sure he would have agreed.
Oh, well, okay, that's another question. He was half dead after all.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the point is about.
So you're suggesting there's a privileged and powerful unknowing versus a powerlessness of unknowing as well?
I guess I'm sort of wondering, like if that stance of the idiot is viable, basically at this point in history.
But Socrates was clever. So because he knew about the world and he knew that everybody knew the world. So he was trying to unearth that. He was trying to bring that to the surface. Whereas the idiot has no idea what is going on. So he has to be initiated each time that he goes into a social circle, or each time that he encounters something. So even the problems that to translate it very crudely, even the problems that we associate today with fascism, we need to rethink them through and through and through every time, as if we're facing a new phenomenon. That is the thing. We don't know the world. This is not the Socratic method. The Socratic method, the world is already there, and we already know it. We have the categories and everything. So it's more Kantian.
I'm not sure I can conflate Socrates and Plato, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking with your comment, Stephen, like the theory of discourses in which how the individual mixes with the social. Lacan says there's a kind of shift, like the possibility of revolutionizing, which you do it at the level of the analyst work with the one-to-one. The possibility of revolutionizing is moving from impotence to impossibility. So in other words, approaching the totality as impossible, like we cannot really make a solution that is total, is not complete ever, it's impossible. So moving like with that sort of understanding that there's always going to be a gap, it might move people from impotence to impossibility.
Which is a recognition of finitude, really.
Absolutely, yeah. Castration, yeah, finitude, limits, yeah.
I think this, what you're suggesting is really quite interesting insofar as it hits at one aspect of Arendt's work, which is the possibility of a new beginning, right? But the possibility of a new beginning is always already offered against the horizon of the world, which we don't know in its totality, but which is in a sense there, right?
Yes.
And it constitutes the condition for the possibility of speech and action, and to which those things also contribute. So it might be a bit of work to get to the point of, in a sense, starting from in a sense, the beginning.
I agree. I completely agree, and it is. I'm not saying that it is easy or it is that, or like. But it's a process of unlearning, I think. And Arendt clearly says that she clearly says those, and this is in Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, she says that we had to learn everything from scratch, because the situation that we were facing was something
Entirely
completely
novel.
new.
That's right.
And the moral reactions that we were giving to it, or the people that were giving to it, they were completely ineffective, and they actually fed into the system
the very
because they
system, yeah,
normalized
yeah.
it. So also like
So-
having that in the background.
So here's a question,
Sure.
and that is, I understand exactly what you're trying to do in terms of not emphasizing continuity insofar as continuity is conditioned for the possibility of sovereignty. But there is a continuity whether we like it or not, and that has to do with capitalism, has to do with the commodity form, and one of the discussions about analogy or a different kind of a logic is really how we understand the nature of the crisis of capitalism. So the point Toscano makes is that we don't have a failed revolution that provides a basis for contemporary fascism, neo-fascism, or post-fascism. It's probably why we want to use those latter terms as opposed to the former, right? We don't have it in the same way that it was there in the 1930s. 1929, the stock market crash. Then you have a mass-based left that seems to be at least poised to take power. This doesn't happen. Today, we don't have that situation, and Toscano says, well, it's that capitalism's all too hegemonic. Well, it is, but it's not. What is it confronting? It's not confronting an organized working class, which would be its gravediggers, but it is confronting a fundamental and deep ecological crisis, whatever you want to call it, the metabolic rift, Anthropocene, and this must be figured in terms of the continuities and discontinuities, right? That's why we talked about this in terms of fascism in the 20th century, imagine the future. One of its sources is futurism itself, right, in the Italian context. We mustn't forget that. And a kind of fetishization of technology, a reactionary modernism, as Jeffrey Hirsch calls it, right? No such thing today. And it seems to be a kind of doubling down, a drilling down, if you will, into the present in order to maintain its coordinates, to maintain its moorings, right? And so it gives it a different kind of cast, discontinuity, but it is a kind of crisis of capitalism. Even though Wall Street is going crazy right now. As we know, it's breaking records, it seems, every second week. But the looming crisis is there, and we're living through the aftermath of 2007, 2008. Those reverberations are being felt, especially in Greece. I think Greece is especially interesting because fascism in the 20th century, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, and as Enzo Traverso makes clear, was about the application of colonial techniques to Europe. It was a self-colonization of Europe. What are we seeing in Greece? The self-colonization of Europe in a particular sort of way, with finance capital right at the center. 20th century it might have been industrial capital that played that kind of role. So I think in a way that's the elephant in the room, right? We need to confront these questions of what is the nature of the capitalist crisis and what kind of a response.
But don't you think that that the aspect of the ecological crisis is going really entwined with the technologies and this hyper present that it's almost as if nowadays more and more, for example, in the health, I'm back in the health kind of agency. There's like an important kind of measure about screen time, reducing screen time, especially in children and teenagers. It's almost as if the technology that we are framed into in this very moment it's kind of naturalizing in a way ideologic enjoyments in which we are forgetting a little bit about
that's a very important
nature.
point. Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
More of a comment than a question, and it's just relating back to the idiot, and a little bit of a defense of Nietzsche because of the the reinterpretation or the fascist Nietzsche, right? I'm thinking about Nietzsche's the three metamorphoses.
Yeah.
So the camel turns into the lion and into the child, and I see the idiot reflected in the child because it's the only only one in the three that has consciousness yet a clean slate. So he's reinterpreting the world and not having any prescribed notions and so
That's wonderful, because Arendt makes specific reference to the child, right?
Yeah.
To us is given a child, and that's the possibility of a new beginning.
Yeah.
So I think it's really
Yeah.
nice. Do you want to, any thoughts about that?
Any thoughts about that? So are you suggesting that there's this element of there's that element of fascism there?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I'm
you're
defending
saying
that.
Okay.
Just this rereading of Nietzsche. He's people
Yes.
are reinterpreting him again.
Yes,
and
yes,
it's
yes.
The
I
same
would
one that,
I would completely agree. And the whole point with reactionarism is, I mean, of course, it owes a lot to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is saying that the more you react, I mean, reaction is a mode of, the idiot cannot react, right? The idiot is an idiot because he cannot react, but he's always someone who's responding to these kinds of situations. And I'm reading the novel right now again from an amazing translation. I mean, not the previous ones, but the new translation is wonderful. And so the more I read into it, the more it's like he's the one who stutters. He's the one who cannot exactly react, and that's why people are calling him the idiot precisely. But then they realize that because he's giving responses and because he's actually engaging in these situations, that you need that kind of a time there. And that time is incalculable time. And that is my point.
Yeah.
So in that
Very
sense, like not letting go of the urgency strategically, or letting go of the emergencies strategically. Not that there are not emergencies or urgencies, but we need to we need to allow time to flourish. And I think in that sense Nietzsche would be exactly on board with us.
Well, it relates so much to the question of the time of the decision, right?
Yeah.
Because here's a sovereign who is in a sense disavowing sovereignty. Like he's not able to come to this decision.
Yes, that's true.
Well, are there any final questions or comments for us? You have.
I have one for
Yeah.
So in your point about the leader, do we need leaders or we don't need leaders?
Whether we want them or not, people seem to emerge as a phenomenon in this context of a certain type. So it's not even, I don't know if we need to answer that question, except that they're there.
They're there.
Yeah, and just one last point also, just about the context in which these things emerge, be it 2008, but we're in a context where we've had a 20, 30-year attack on civil society. So these organizations or movements that did filter out this stupidity have been under attack for so long that when these moments, they emerge in a context where these attacks and undermining of civil society has gone on for so long that we don't even remember those institutions that did exist. So this question of how we move forward, et cetera, as well, is about what kind of institutions, what kind of structures that defend against that idea can be structured.
Yeah. It's a politics of memory.
Yeah.
Fundamentalism. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. So